Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reasons for Hope, COVID and the Coming Year, a special live stream presented by GZERO Media in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Eurasia Group. I'm Bertha Coombs. Over the next hour, we're going to examine three key facets of the pandemic as we approach the end of 2020, the latest on vaccine development and distribution, a deep dive into how the crisis has disproportionately impacted women, and a look at the road ahead for the US and the world. You'll hear from some of the most distinguished experts and leaders in their fields, including former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who will join us later in the program. And we'll feature live audience polling as well. If you're watching on GZERO Media, on that site right now, you'll see a chat window to the right of the video screen on a desktop or below the player on a mobile device. You can sign in using Vimeo, Facebook, or as a guest. After you sign in, you can cast your vote on the questions we pose, and we'll share the results in real time. So to kick things off, I'm joined by Mark Sussman, CEO of the Gates Foundation, and Ian Bremmer, President of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. Gentlemen, thanks for having me, and let's kick things off with you, Ian. You know, it has been 9 months since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. Give us your sense of where we stand now.
Well, I mean, this is the biggest crisis of our lifetimes, and it's kind of astonishing that from a global perspective, there's been virtually zero coordination. The G7 didn't even meet this year. The G20 did, but has been completely absent in terms of action. The US-China relationship is considerably worse than it was before. And indeed, there's a lot more geopolitical tension around the world, in some cases accelerated by coronavirus. So that's the bad news. The good news is that governments around the world acting themselves nonetheless had similar playbooks economically and largely read from it. And so whether we're talking about, countries in Asia or in Europe or in the Western Hemisphere, the ability of central banks and ministries of finance, here, the Department of Treasury, all putting enormous amounts of cash out over the course of 2020, helping to ensure that the worst was not borne on the backs of working and middle classes. Now that's starting to become a problem. On the healthcare side, though, the responses have been all over the map. And as we've seen in the United States and Brazil and the United Kingdom, a lot of governments you expected would have done really well really didn't, because the virus got politicized, because they didn't lead with science, and because they weren't really fast to respond. And that's perhaps been the biggest disappointment over the course of the year. Now, as we look to 2021, great news in terms of vaccines we'll be talking about today, but the economic news is becoming increasingly challenging, and whether the governments are capable of stepping up is a big and open question.
Well, let's pick up on that note of vaccines, Mark. We have the UK already approving the Pfizer vaccine, and we expect that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines will get emergency use approval here in the US within the next couple of weeks and perhaps start distribution before the end of the year. Can you tell us a little bit about where we stand with these and bring us beyond the hype to what these really can accomplish?
Yes, so first of all, it's worth taking a step back and saying this is completely unprecedented. The scientific advances to allow a vaccine for a disease that we didn't really know existed until the beginning of this year, before the end of the year, is absolutely unprecedented. And it's great to see, and it's very encouraging, because the science that they use to target to get those first wave of vaccines, the Pfizer, BioNTech and the Moderna one, and also the AstraZeneca, are all targeting the same part of the virus. And that makes us quite encouraged that some of the next wave of vaccines that are in the pipeline, some of which may be cheaper and easier to distribute globally, will also be effective. So that is the good news. The bad news is the challenge of the logistics of how you actually get these vaccines into the billions of people who need them. From the manufacturing, the distribution, the logistics, the cold chain, how you think about the prioritization, the fact that most of these vaccines, actually all the ones to date, require 2 doses. So you've got to track people to come for the first dose and make sure they come back and the same person comes back for their second dose. So that's pretty unprecedented, but it's doable. The world has experience in how you do this, particularly in areas where the Gates Foundation works in the developing world, where we have been doing this around antiretrovirals and HIV/AIDS, around regular vaccine programs through the Gavi Vaccine Alliance. And so there are steps and roadmaps that we can take, but it's going to be very, very difficult and challenging.
Yeah, let's talk about that complexity, the fact that it is a 2-dose. This is a whole new type of vaccine. The science is quite fascinating on the messenger RNA, really targeting the virus that way. How is it going to be easier in the West than in Africa? I know that the Gates Foundation has essentially a giant thermos that is able to keep these vaccines at a very low temperature without electricity. Is that going to make it more accessible for people in Africa or really remote parts of Asia?
Yes, so it is doable. I mean, the Ebola vaccine, which was developed, has to be done in what's called ultra cold chain as well. So, and we successfully did that in the Democratic Republic of Congo and parts of West Africa. And you use some of these devices like the one you mentioned to keep vaccines cold. But part of the challenge with some of the first wave vaccines, they're also difficult and more expensive to distribute. The scale of what needs to be produced and distributed is just much, much larger. So the difference between a $50 vaccine or a $20 vaccine or a $4 vaccine is immense. And we really need to get vaccines down to the $3 or $4 a dose if you're really going to be reaching it at scale. So we can certainly do, and we are working along with many other partners to ensure that at least for critical groups like healthcare workers and very high-risk groups, that you will be able to get access to this first wave of vaccines, including in parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America where the needs are great. But the long-term solution really is going to need a sort of cheaper, easier to manufacture at scale, easier to distribute. And again, we're encouraged that some of the vaccines that are likely to come down the pipeline soon will meet those parameters, but we don't have them yet, and they certainly don't have all the approval and safety and efficacy data yet.
Terrific. Well, that brings us to our first panelist. When it comes to vaccine distribution, there are certainly logistical and political concerns, but there are also societal issues like mistrust and the proliferation of misinformation. Heidi Larson is an anthropologist and director of the Vaccine Confidence Project. Welcome, Heidi. Thanks so much for taking the time. And I want to start with the title of your organization that really gets down to one of the key issues here, which is confidence.
Yes, my research group is called the Vaccine Confidence Project, and we really all of our work is to try to map and understand what are all the drivers that influence people's decisions about vaccines, and that can be for good to build confidence as well as that can possibly undermine it. And it's certainly been a challenge. You would think in the context of such a global crisis, both a health emergency and with all the knock-on effects on society and the economy, people, the hope would be that the vaccine would even change the minds of skeptics to see the important value of a vaccine. But we are seeing a kind of unusual wave and exponential increase in some of the distrusting vaccine networks jumping together with the anti-mask and anti-lockdown protests. But I think that's, we're in a time of hyper uncertainty. So I think what's really important is that we don't focus on deleting this kind of anti-behavior, but focus, because that will be a whole other issue. And some of it's not even misinformation. I mean, it's really deep emotion. I think we need to fill the space and help people connect the dots of pieces of information. We have not only a complex environment in terms of every day, we don't know what the guidance is going to be next in terms of just the COVID response. But now we're getting, particularly in recent weeks, pieces of information about these new vaccines. Now, this could be, on the one hand, is a huge opportunity for vaccine confidence more broadly, because I don't think we've ever had such an opportunity to bring the public along to learn about the journey of what it takes to make a vaccine. It's something that I think we've needed for a while, and here's a real live, real-time opportunity. And I think we need to kind of turn these bits and pieces of information into one coherent story and bring the public along on this journey, because right now they're seeing these, a little bit here, a little bit there, and filling in the space themselves. And that creates an anxiety, and the whole speed of it. In fact, the speed of it is actually something to celebrate, because it's about technologies. It's not about shortcutting safety processes.
And yet people, that's one of the things that does worry people, that this may have been rushed, and that the people who are getting this, notwithstanding the people who've already, the thousands, tens of thousands of people who've been in the trials, are going to be guinea pigs, because we really don't know how long it will last. We don't know if it will prevent you from actually still spreading the disease. But one of the things that is interesting to me, you talk about building confidence. It was just about a year ago, I was hearing Paul Farmer talk about dealing with this in Africa with Ebola. And one of the things they had to deal with was, families seeing their loved ones taken away immediately, so they couldn't do their burial rituals, and that created a sense of mistrust. I think one of the ways that they reached that was talking to people. What are some of the strategies that are successful in bringing people along in this conversation, particularly in places like France and the US, where there's a lot of information about the science, and yet there's a lot of resistance?
Well, I wouldn't start with what's interesting. I was going to say wouldn't start with the most anti-extreme groups in this. I think what's interesting in the pieces of misinformation out there, even the ones that are motivated by trying to undermine trust in the science, the misinformation, we've just done a recent control trial on this, the misinformation that looks like science, that has pieces of scientific looking images, are much more influential on people and will have more impact to either reduce or increase, but in the case of misinformation, influence people more than just emotional images. For instance, in the example of the mRNA vaccine, there's a circulating perception that it's going to alter DNA, and there's a lot of things circulating with actually images that look like they're from a genomic textbook, but then the interpretation is absolutely incorrect. But I think what we need to do is get the story in there that explains things and really flood the space with the right story. And we're not there enough. And I think that's part of the problem right now is filling the space with something that's coherent, something that makes sense, and something that connects the dots so people see where we're going, rather than parceling out a little bit at a time, which I think from a scientific perspective, that's the way things are moving. But I think from the public perspective, particularly in a number of communities, that, are they giving us this piece because we're not sure if we trust that? So we need to build trust. And also we need to be listening. We need to understand what are the concerns of the public and be responsive to what their questions are, because what we push out as information is what we think is important, but it may not be what their concerns are.
Do you think once people do start getting the vaccine, that will help convince people? I spoke with an African-American doctor who said she participated in the Moderna trial because she wanted to be able to tell her patients, look, I rolled up my sleeve and I had this injected in me.
I think that's going to be very impactful. I mean, people have literally are saying, I'm going to wait for the next guy to get it, and then that'll influence me. And I think the more we get that chain, that momentum going, I think that will be really valuable. And I'm confident that if we get that right and bring people along, and then also make sure that the people who are getting vaccinated, we have a plan to help, make that visible and encourage them to share that news.
Does the fact that the vaccine might have side effects for some people, I mean, I can tell you my own personal experience. I recently did the Shingrix and the booster, and I felt lousy for a few days afterwards. I don't want to get shingles though, and I know people who have, but for me, it made me a little, I was a little reticent to get that second booster, knowing I was going to feel lousy again.
Well, that is one of the, even though we've had no serious side effects with any of these vaccines since the start, there are some mild and there's fatigue, and you don't feel great for some of them, and not for everybody. Again, it depends on how the person tolerates it, but I think that's something we need to let people know. But you do get over it. It's the initial. It's not that different from what sometimes you feel with a flu vaccine. It kind of, but as you say, you have to put that in the perspective of what COVID is.
Exactly. Well, let's open it up to our audience. Time now for our first audience poll. And we're asking, how likely are you to receive the COVID-19 vaccine when you are eligible? The choices are very likely, somewhat, not likely. We'll have your results in just a moment. But let's bring back in Ian and Mark. Ian, do you think that the politics surrounding the vaccine may also have contributed to people being more skeptical?
A little bit, but frankly, I'm much less concerned about that part of it than I have been over the last year. I mean, I've got a mask here, and you've seen how much that's been politicized in the United States. It's your choice. Do you want to wear it? Not. You're showing loyalty for Trump, and some people think that means you shouldn't wear a mask at all. That's not
just in the U.S.
When we talk about the vaccine.
We've also seen that.
I know it's all over the world. I get it. I'm just saying that I do believe that the idea of a vaccine, we haven't seen political figures that matter come out publicly and say, I'm deeply skeptical about this, in a way that there has been a lot of politicization in many countries around treatment and around masks and around social distancing. I think this is different. I also think it's different because social media does a better job of taking down, obviously, conspiracy theories and false news when it comes to science, when it comes to a vaccine, as opposed to election fraud. When it comes to politics, it's a much harder thing for a Google or a Facebook to say, or Twitter to say, we've got a problem with this post, but not this one from a different political figure. That's clearly a problem. We know there's anti-vax sentiment out there. We have to do a better job. It's great that we see Presidents Bush and Obama and Clinton all saying that they're going to roll up their sleeves and actually get these vaccines on television. I think that matters. They wouldn't have said that about election fraud. It is different. And in order for us all to come back together, the point that's being made, we're all going to have to show, influencers are going to have to show that this is something that is not only okay, but it's a requirement. If we want to get society back as fast as possible, as healthy as possible, and the economics back, we have to take these vaccines.
Let's talk about that requirement, Mark. I was listening to some officials from Intermountain Healthcare, and they're going to be in that first wave to get them for their healthcare workers. They are not going to mandate it. Do you think that we should or we should not mandate the vaccine? Would that make people more reticent if it's mandatory?
Yeah, so this really is about two sets of things. One is making sure the regulatory process is effective and trusted. In the end, you've got to rely on regulators. That's why they exist. That's why we go through all these protocols. That's the science and the technical side. And then, as Heidi said, it's also a very emotional set of issues. So back to your example of the doctor who was in the Moderna trial, so much of this is really about local trusted validators. When we do global vaccine campaigns, for example, the polio vaccine campaigns in Africa, and this year is the year that we finally had Africa declared wild polio virus free. It was one of the big global health successes amidst all these global health challenges. We used religious leaders, community leaders, other local validators. It's not necessarily the medical leaders or the professionals who are the key people. It's, who do you trust in your community? Who are the validators? And then how do you build that critical mass? And I think it's much more about that. It's combining the trust in the science and then with the local trusted validators rather than anything, the sort of discussions around mandates or related issues. Really, it's who do you trust and how do we make sure the trusted people become the right spokespeople early?
We're getting our poll results in, and it is 82% very likely, 14% somewhat, 2% not likely. We're likely preaching to the choir here with this group, Heidi, but what does that tell you?
Looks like India. I was just we do global research on different sentiments around the COVID response more broadly, but particularly the COVID vaccine and in waves. And that pretty much lines up to where India is. It's the most, India and China, that looks pretty much like the lineup, but that is an outlier in the global work. It's quite varied. Actually, DR Congo had the strongest amount of disagreeing and absolutely not going to take it, followed by Pakistan. Yeah, followed by Pakistan and Nigeria, which we know where we've had troubles before. But DRC, we've been working a lot there on community engagement, rumor management, trust building around Ebola vaccine trials. And it's a complex environment at multiple levels, politically, conflict, there's violence in some settings. And so it's complicated there. But I think overall, most of the countries are hovering about what they could do herd immunity if those maybe I'll do it turn to I'll do it. We'll get to herd immunity or community immunity. But, it's fragile and we can't risk kind of letting ourselves be vulnerable to kind of anti-sentiments or shocks in the system. And I think we need to be really vigilant. I think we do have a choir here. I don't think we're but that's good to hear, and it's heartening. And I think the more we can, and when you see, it's interesting, the whole psychologically, when you see, 83% here are going to take it, maybe I will take it after all. We're creatures of herd behavior. Sometimes I talk about herd immunity or herd mentality. We do follow others. And if we get enough of a movement going, now that movement can be also quickly disrupted if something doesn't go well. But I think the thing is, we're not going to have the vaccines tomorrow. We see that we're approaching rollout. Now's the time. We've got to get out there. We've got to engage community leaders. I live in Hackney in London and across from a huge Nigerian church, which reminds me of all of our polio days in Nigeria. But their if I could go, I got one or two people in that church across the street, you'd have a couple thousand people.
Right, that influencer effect.
Yeah. And I think that, you don't have to go halfway around the world to find community influencers.
Heidi, thank you so much for your insights, and thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Happy to be here.
So, terrific. So let's move on to our next topic. We're also taking a look today at how the pandemic is disproportionately impacting women and girls. In the US, 865,000 women left the workforce just in September of this year. That's 4 times more than men. It's a scenario playing out across the world, according to the United Nations, and cases of domestic abuse and exploitation have also risen globally during the pandemic. Baroness Minouche Shafik is the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, and just this year was named a life peer in the UK House of Lords. I'm not sure what title I should use with regard to that, but welcome and thank you so much for your time today. So I wanted to start off.
And please call me Minouche.
All right, Minouche. Obviously, you got the red memo that the guys didn't seem to get. So in red solidarity, I wanted to start off with a Financial Times op-ed that you wrote. It is titled, "COVID-19 has revealed deep flaws in our societies that have been festering for decades." Can you explain that in a broader sense? And then let's home in on what that means with regard to women in the economy.
Okay. So the pandemic came on top of a sense of disaffection that was really very widespread across the world. And we saw it manifested in many different ways. The rise of populism, the culture wars, the anti-immigrant sentiment in many countries, the insecurity about work and the consequences for the future of work, and the tensions around climate change. Polling around the world showed that 4 out of 5 people in countries as diverse as the US, Europe, China, India, and a whole array of developing countries said the system isn't working for me. And that system is what I call the social contract, the contract around what individuals can expect from society and what society expects of them. And I think there are 2 big reasons why we saw that disaffection. One is technology, and the second is the changing role of women. On technology, we know that we've seen this pattern as technology has evolved, exacerbated by globalization, that we've seen a transformation whereby the middle class is being hollowed out in many advanced economies. Technology tends to favor the more educated, and then there are jobs for those with very low skills. But many people feel that their life prospects are much diminished. And then on the changing role of women, in most parts of the world, women do most of the caring. But that's changed dramatically as women have become much more educated and more employed in the formal labor market. And so as a result of that, the old social contract, which relied on women to look after the young and the old for free, was put under huge pressure as women entered the labor force. Of course, COVID came on top of this and revealed these tensions in an enormous way, because it mainly affected those who were in precarious work, in those jobs where they had very little security and very low pay, many of whom were women, but also women who bore the brunt of the caring roles had to go on double duty because of COVID.
Yeah, there are women who are in jobs that they can work from home, and yet for a number of them, they just couldn't handle having their children at home and possibly also having an elderly parent who they have to care for as well. So there have been a number of women who have stepped away because of that. Are we in danger of losing these women long term? And what does that mean for the economy?
Yeah. Well, I think the crux of the issue is that women do more unpaid work than men. On average in the world, women do 2 hours more of unpaid work around the world. Varies enormously. Women in Norway do about 20 minutes more unpaid work than men, whereas in Pakistan they do 1,000 times more unpaid work than men. And so that unpaid work is mainly around caring for the young and the old. And of course, COVID has increased the need to care for the young and the old, because children are home from school, the elderly are very vulnerable. And so there is a very real risk that we take a step back in terms of women's economic goals. On the other hand, and I know the title of this session is Reasons for Hope, it's also an opportunity to look at changing the phenomenon of unpaid work and trying to find ways to support women to both be economically productive, but also manage their caring responsibilities. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you would like.
Well, as it turns out, we have a viewer question for you on that very subject. Gloria Felt here in the US asks, what's the most effective way to put women at the center of the economic recovery?
Great question. So I would say two things to that. I think I'll start with the most effective issue. The most important issue for women's employment and ability to be productive in the economy is to deal with the caring of children and the elderly. And so finding mechanisms through public support of childcare and public funding. In the US, it would help if there was a federally mandated parental leave. The most progressive countries have made that parental leave available to be shared between men and women. So, for example, in Iceland, a couple gets 7 months of parental leave for the woman, 7 months for the man, and 7 months to be shared between them. And if the man doesn't take his 7 months, it's lost. And so deliberately trying to balance the responsibilities for caring for young children more evenly. And secondly, to deal with caring for the old and finding, again, public support mechanisms to provide a safety net so that people who are elderly know that some element of social care will be borne and paid for by society, rather than assuming that women will do it for free. I think if you address those two issues, there could be huge benefits. If I may, I might just give you a historical example of the potential impact. If you look at, to start from 1960, 94% of doctors and lawyers in 1960 were men. Fast forward 50 years, 62% of doctors and lawyers in the US were men. Why? And what happened? Of course, women started to enter those professions. And that phenomenon of women entering professions in which they hadn't traditionally been in can explain between 20 and 40% of the productivity gains in the US economy over that 50-year period. That's a phenomenal number. And where does that productivity gain come from? It comes from drawing on a wider pool of talent. Rather than only drawing your doctors and lawyers from white men, suddenly you were recruiting doctors and lawyers who were women, Black, and ethnic minorities, who were more talented than the previous cohort. And that's what generated those productivity gains. So this is not, I often say, this is not politically correct equality speak. I'm talking hard-nosed economics. How do we get more productivity? We get more productivity by using all of the talent in our economy.
Well, one of the hard-nosed economic issues in this is that a lot of women of color and people of color work essential jobs that we took for granted. Hourly wage, oftentimes doing childcare on a cash basis where they don't get benefits. And normally, in times like this, their wages would rise, and they have somewhat. But do you see a momentum coming out of this to recognize those workers and to bring them in and really recognize their essential service? And, I know that there are pushback from small businesses that say, listen, I can't raise my wages to $20 an hour. That would just bankrupt me. But, large corporations are feeling some of the pressure, but they don't seem to be quite there.
Well, I think it's very interesting which categories of workers were classified as essential during this crisis. It was nurses and security guards and people who worked in supermarkets. It was not doctors and lawyers and bankers. And suddenly you realize who we needed for our societies to function. And yet, ironically, many of them were the lowest paid and, as you say, on precarious work contracts. We've had a huge pendulum shift really since the 80s to having more flexibility in our labor markets. And I'm an economist. I believe in efficiency and productivity, and more flexibility in the labor market is a good thing for that. But I think the pendulum has swung too far. And what we haven't done is provide the additional security that needs to come with that flexibility. If you look at, say, the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, Finland, the Netherlands as well, They have incredibly flexible labor markets. People get hired and fired all the time. In fact, the Nordics have the highest rate of churn of any labor market in Europe. People lose their job all the time and then they move to another job. The reason they can sustain a high rate of flexibility is because people know if they lose their job, they'll get pretty generous unemployment for over a year that is pretty close to their previous wage, so they can sustain their standard of living. They also know that they'll get a lot of training to get them into a new job very quickly. And they know that if they don't accept that new job, their benefits will diminish. And so the system is flexible, but also very generous and very assertive about getting people back into work. I think that's a much better balance than what we've got at the moment, where people are in incredibly precarious situations, and as a consequence, insecure and at risk.
Mark, I want to bring you back into the conversation here, because for the Gates Foundation, gender equity is very important. Melinda Gates has talked a lot about that and how empowering women ultimately does empower the economy. Do you worry about some of the fallout that we've seen from the pandemic really setting that cause back?
Yeah, very much so. And not just in rich countries, but really across the world, in the developing world. So you've got at one level exactly what Manoush's been talking about, the challenges of women in the modern labor force disproportionately affected, the overwhelming need for stronger, more robust mandated caregiving and caregiving structures. Hopefully that case has now been made so strongly there's an opportunity to do something very different. But also across the developing world, you've seen the setbacks that have happened to just regular access to healthcare for women seeking childcare or maternal care and antenatal care, because COVID disrupted that disproportionately. You've seen support going away from women farmers or other categories of workers across Africa and Asia. And so there really is an opportunity now to do something different. It's been highlighted hugely. This year is actually the 25th anniversary of the famous Beijing Women's Conference, and we were hoping it was going to be an amazing platform to highlight a lot of these issues. Obviously, that got a bit sabotaged by COVID, but we hope there is going to be a follow-up forum hosted by President Macron in Paris called the Generation Equality Forum next year to mark that moment. And our hope is that we can actually combine a whole set of activities from sort of the caregiving and training and women in leadership support in the rich world to better access to digital financial services and assets and training in the developing world. So it's a hugely important moment. We're worried about the challenges that COVID has highlighted, but we have to take advantage of it to do something much, much better in the future.
I want to get back to the sense of hope, and Ian and Manoush, I'd like you to talk about this as well. But in this country, we've talked a lot about social services and the social safety net. And what was interesting was when you saw people get that $1,200 basically relief check just went out to people, that helped maintain the economy, that helped people stay in their homes and helped people sort of weather that initial storm. Given that we haven't gotten a second bill in this country, some of those effects are starting to wane. But do you think that puts the issue of providing a greater safety net on the table to discuss? Andrew Yang talked about it in his presidential campaign, and it was seen as a bit of a fluke. But I'm wondering if there's greater legitimacy, especially looking at the countries where their economies didn't suffer as much because they have more of a safety net.
I mean, there has to be. The markets are at record levels, and the average person is not benefiting from it. That's how we got Trump. That's how we got polarization, not just in the United States politically, but across most of the developed world and a lot of the developing world too. Look at Brazil, look at Mexico, so many different countries. And this crisis is accelerating that inequality, that failure of safety nets, that feeling of illegitimacy of political institutions all over the world. You mentioned the United States that we provided some checks for folks, but when we're talking about women in this segment, women in the workplace in the United States, we have literally lost a generation of progress in the last 9 months. because of coronavirus, we now have women participation in the U.S. economy down to 1988 levels. That's astonishing. No economist back in January would have thought that could be remotely possible. What would the shock have been that would have made that happen? The shock was that we lost a lot of jobs that weren't in the knowledge economy, and suddenly you had to take care of a bunch of folks. And who's doing it? Oh, the women who don't get paid for that, the women who are already in the informal economy. That's in the United States. And women dominate the informal economy in terms of their labor all over the world. So this issue of social safety net is absolutely paramount. It's become vastly more important on the back of this crisis. But whether there is the political leadership to respond to it, I mean, Andrew Yang, I found him inspiring. I know him pretty well. He got about 4% maxed out in the polls. Maybe he'll get a cabinet post, but I don't think you're going to get a lot of legislation through at the national level, given how blocked and gridlocked that's going to be in the U.S. Like Manoush was talking about Iceland. I think you'll see some experiments in cities, in states, in the United States. You'll see some additional smaller countries. You'll see some countries like, we haven't mentioned New Zealand yet, but on this one, they're also really good, right? There'll be more of that. There'll be more stories for us to talk about, but they need to be examples for much broader initiatives. And right now, those broader initiatives, we're not seeing very much.
New Zealand with female leadership. Manoush, let's give you the last word. What are you hopeful for in the year ahead as we see an economic recovery? Do you think some of these people will be able to come back into the economy?
Yeah, I think the coalition for potential political change is so huge after this pandemic. It's women, it's people in precarious work, it's young people who've also suffered economically hugely. So I think the political pressure will be significant. I think on your point on safety nets, I think there's a deep misunderstanding about what the safety net is for. You know, the welfare state, as it's called, is only about 1/4 what we would call Robin Hood, taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. What the welfare state is 3/4 is a piggy bank. We pay money in, we pay tax when we're earning, but we're able to take money out over the course of our own lives when we're in hard times, or when we're very young and we benefit from education, or when we're very old when we receive state pensions. And so that piggy bank function needs to be explained much more. And that's what the safety net is for. It's a piggy bank for all of society. So when the fluctuations in the overall economy, but also in our own lives occur, that we have somewhere to go. And I think that good political leaders will explain that. I can't help but say also something about the need to get more women leaders, and particularly more women leaders in economics, because many of these decisions around economic policy will be taken by economists, and economics is probably the discipline in the world which has made the least progress. We only have, say, in a typical graduate program in economics around the world, you have fewer than 30% women. We've got some great examples. Janet Yellen in the US is a very exciting appointment, but it's, you know, it's no accident that when Ursula von der Leyen was the families minister in Germany, she made huge changes to family policy and parental leave in Germany. When Christine Lagarde was at the IMF, she got the IMF to focus on the growth consequences of getting women into the labor market. And so I'm very pleased that we're doing some work with the Gates Foundation and with Pivotal Ventures to think about how do we close this gap? How do we get more women into leadership roles in economics? And I think if we do that, there's a lot of hope for the future.
Thank you so much, Manoush Shafik. Thank you, Shafiq. Thank you for your time today and for your insights. No, we're honored now to welcome, terrific. We're honored now to welcome the first female Secretary of State in U.S. history, speaking of women leaders, and chair of Albright Stonebridge Group and Albright Capital Management, Madeleine Albright. Madam Secretary, thanks so much for joining us. And I want to talk to you about sort of the big picture of America's role in the global recovery. But first, I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts on what Manoush and the rest were talking about with regard to the economy right now.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be with you and friends and to have a chance to talk about this. I really appreciated what Manoush had to say. I do think that the whole issue of the social contract is something that is essential to look at. I've been looking at it from a political science perspective, which really shows that it has broken down in terms of that people gave up some of their individual rights in order to be protected and respected by the state. And the bottom line is that both parts of the social contract have not been fulfilled in many ways. So I think it is the largest question that we have to deal with in what is now an entirely new era. I do think that there's a very specific aspect in the way that women have been treated that have been described, I think, very well in the previous discussion. And I think that there need to be some ways to rectify the situation, because frankly, women are more than half the population in every country, and it is a resource that is not being used properly in so many different ways. And so a lot of work needs to be done. And by the way, what I do find interesting, and you, Manish mentioned, and you did, I think also, is that the countries where COVID is being controlled are mostly run by women. You have New Zealand, Taiwan, Finland, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Iceland. And so I think that there are capabilities that are there that need to be used. And I do think that one of the aspects that you pointed out, the UN is looking at this also, is women need to be part of the discussion of solving the problem, not victims of it in one form or another, because I think there are a lot of good ideas that come out of that. But I very much agree with this whole concept of the social contract, in fact, broadened even larger than the way that Manoush was discussing it. I think that is what brought us the current issues that are there in terms of divisions in our societies, which are very damaging.
You know, this has been probably the greatest global crisis we've seen in a couple of generations, since World War II, the Cold War. I would love to get your sense on what it means for the institutions that rose out of that last crisis. We had the UN, we had NATO, we had multilateralism and participation. Where do you see us going from this crisis? Are there going to be some lasting effects to those institutions?
Well, I think those institutions need a little refurbishing. They have worked out of a certain context. We are now living in a very different era. And I think that we need to assume, I've been saying just flat out that we are living in a different situation that we haven't seen before in terms of the effect of technology, globalization, a number of aspects that were not out there before. And I think the institutions need to be refurbished. I'm kind of known as multilateral Madeleine, but the bottom line is that I do think that, President Clinton is the one who said we were the indispensable nation, but there is nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It means that we need to have partners. And I think it's very clear in dealing with this horrendous pandemic that partnerships and dealing together is something that has to happen. There's no one country that can deal with this by itself. And so it is a call for refurbishing and developing those partnerships to be very effective. I think that the UN needs to be refurbished. And as I've said, it's a cliche. If it didn't exist, we'd reinvent it. And I think that's what we need to do. And there are
So how would you reinvent it? How would you reinvent it now? What do we need in this new era?
Well, I think certain parts of it need to have more power, the selection of who is on committees. I have often said the UN is the dictatorship of the alphabet. So you put up some country that has an authoritarian regime as head of the Human Rights Commission. So there have to be other ways for making those decisions. I think that the Secretary General has to be somebody that has the potential of really making a difference, and that the UN staff is not of elephantine proportions. And the US cannot dictate by, I can tell you my own experience of having been ambassador there, just at a time that I was being instructed to do something to help reform the UN Secretariat, we unilaterally decide not to pay what we're supposed to pay, creating an artificial crisis, leading our best friends, the British, to deliver a line they'd waited more than 200 years to say was representation without taxation. So if we're going to we don't pull out of the WHO. We stay there at the table in order to try to figure out what it can do, and not talk about the importance of sovereignty all the time, but understand that sometimes you have to give up a little bit of sovereignty in this new situation to get some solutions.
To a great extent, the US, in sort of saying America first, the current administration relinquished some of that role of leadership on the globe. What's if you were going to refurbish the multilateral partnerships, does the US have to be in the driver's seat? And what's a better, more sustainable way to be able to move forward?
I think the U.S. does not have to be in the driver's seat, but the U.S. can't be AWOL. I think that we need to play our part. We need to understand how to be partners and decide that, by the way, compromise is not a four-letter word. And so I think it's very important to look at how agreements can be made. I also do think the following thing that I've been advocating for a long time. The UN and other organizations need to recognize the role of the private sector. And I'm not just saying that because I'm sitting here with the Gates Foundation, but there's no question that foundations have made an incredible difference. The private corporations have made a difference, and there need to be at the table early, not just to kind of pick up the pieces when things are not working, but to be there as part of the decision-making process. And I have advocated that for a very long time in terms of the contributions, both in the way of thinking and operating and having public-private partnerships. I believe that's another part of the refurbishing process.
We have a question from a viewer, David Rickenbach in the US, and he asks, what are the tools for restoring public trust in institutions and government? And I would say that's not just a question for here in the US.
I think that it does depend on a lot of different aspects. One is transparency. I think that is a very important part. Also ways of trying to one of the real issues that's out there now is what is information? How do people get their information? All of a sudden, this living in a world of alternative facts makes life very different, but transparency is very important. Answering questions, having governments that actually listen and talk to their people, and develop an understanding that a lot of solutions come bottom up, not just top down. But it's going to take a while because the institutional structures have ceded whatever trust and respect that they've had, and that has to be regained slowly. I think it is something that has to be done, but information is obviously a reason, and transparency and understanding that corruption is the cancer of democracies.
So let's bring in our audience here with one more poll question today. In the coming year, what level of global cooperation is needed to rebuild after COVID? More cooperation, less, or the same? So we'll get to that answer in a minute. I'd like to bring back in Ian and Mark. And Ian, you call this GZERO because there's no longer that leadership from the multilaterals. That was your sense. Do you think we are entering a new era?
Sure, I agree with my friend Madeleine quite a bit on this. I mean, if you think about the rise of China and its unwillingness to align with American and Western political and economic values and standards and institutions, that's something that just about everyone in the West presumed was going to happen as they got wealthier. It hasn't. It changes the nature of the global order. If you think about the big architecture that's being created right now, we just a couple weeks ago, we had the largest ever multilateral trade deal signed in history. The United States was not a part of it. It was driven in Asia largely by China. Wasn't high standard, right? But still, it's going to reduce tariffs. It's going to lead to more economic growth. As Madeleine said, we're AWOL. We can't be AWOL on a deal like that. It's not okay. We can't be AWOL from the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic. That's honestly an obscenity. Now, there is an opportunity here because the Biden administration is going to throw away America First. And, they are going to rejoin multilateral institutions. They'll rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. They'll get back involved in the WHO and the COVAX initiative. I feel pretty confident they'll join as well. Lots of other things we could point to as well. But we have to recognize that it's not just about one president. There were an awful lot of Americans that were saying, hey, this free trade stuff doesn't work for me. Hey, this United States acting as global sheriff doesn't help me. The United States being, an example, an exemplar, the indispensable nation that other countries would look at as a beacon. And if we don't even believe in our democratic institutions ourselves, why would other countries look at the US and say, we want our political system to run like that? They wouldn't. And so I think there's a lot of rebuilding that's going to be required, and not just out of the White House over the coming years. And I feel fairly confident that Secretary Albright and I agree on that one.
Secretary Albright, I bet you do.
Well, definitely in terms of the rebuilding. And I think we do have in the Biden administration, those who want to listen, have a certain amount of humility and are not going to go around saying our way or the highway all the time. But we do need to recognize there's a lot of work to do. And by the way, we need to explain how domestic and foreign policy go together, that the farmer that lives in the middle of the United States does want to know what our trade policy is and how to work, and the transparency that's required for that kind of a discussion. By the way, Ian and I got the blue memo.
There you go. There you go. Mark, I wonder about, for NGOs, it's always treacherous to deal with different governments. You're sometimes dealing with governments that aren't necessarily leaders, and yet you still need to deal with them. Are there things that we can take from NGOs that can help us understand a little better about how to sort of get back to this global cooperation?
Well, if you pull back just to where we started the conversation, the role of government is absolutely essential if you're going to deal with the wider issues of the sort of social contract and obligations to citizens in any country, especially the poorest, the neediest, the women that we've talked about. But it's tough to actually do in execution, and it's tough to think about how you do that globally. So Madeleine and Ian have both talked about the US re-engaging globally, and that's great, and I expect we will see it from the Biden administration. But the scale and scope of how you do that is really important. So if you take something like global health security, we've had the world's biggest lesson in how critical it is to invest in prevention and not just cure and treatment. The world wishes it had invested a few billion more dollars in preparing better surveillance, better vaccine preparation, better treatment preparation against a disease like this. And that should be number one on the agenda for next year for the world. In addition to the rollout and the reasons for optimism, we need to build a new infrastructure that has a stronger World Health Organization, stronger global surveillance, stronger R&D into global health. Yet currently that's not on the radar screen. Even in the US, the current compromise stimulus bill that's being discussed on Capitol Hill has $0 for anything international. And it's not that people are against it when you talk to them. It's just, it didn't occur to us. Oh, yeah, maybe should we do that? And you go, yes, you absolutely need the United States front and center, making a significant contribution to something like the COVAX initiative, which is designed to try and get equitable, efficient access to vaccines all over the world, because that's actually not that difficult to do, but you need the funding, you need the support, and you absolutely need the US at the forefront, because the scale in which the US engages is just different to the way in which other countries engage. And ideally, that actually provides a platform for sort of common shared public goods, including with the likes of China or countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, because again, this current crisis is a great example. No country can avoid it, and no country can solve it alone.
Look, we've got the results in on our poll, and once again, this is an audience that's very well engaged. 97% believe we need more cooperation, and 1% say less, 1% say the same. So, oh, sorry, actually, we just got in. It's 98% that say more. Clearly, people are anxious to see that. And in some ways, I think they are fatigued by all of the fighting. Madam Secretary, as your successor is poised to come up for confirmation and be confirmed, our next Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, what advice would you give him, and what do you think should be his top priority?
Well, I think the top priority is dealing with COVID in so many ways, because it's a combination of having to have the foreign cooperation on all of that, and to really show the United States as an example, and also dealing with the effects of it, because it really does deal with the economic situation in many countries, how we cooperate. And so the State Department has to operate within what is of major concern to the American people, and then also deal with the issue very strongly, because as Ian mentioned, how we deal with China, because it's a part of this story in terms of getting the second largest economy to cooperate with us, and not to see everything as just a matter of being adversarial. It's the job of the Secretary of State to operate statecraft, which is to look at where we are adversaries, where we compete, and where we can cooperate. And so, by the way, it's one of the all-time great jobs. And I know Tony well. I think he's going to do a terrific job. And the idea of how there is more kind of American whole of government in terms of dealing with these issues, because they take more than just one department. And there are issues out there that have not been dealt with well, and to return America to the American state, to the world stage, in a way that is suitable to what is appropriate and reflects the wishes and wills of our people.
But does this next administration, does Secretary-elect Blinken, do they face an uphill battle in the sense that we had this sense that even if there were different administrations, different parties, there was a sense of continuum of the United States' role in the world. And now it seems to me that it would be hard to trust that, listen, if I do a treaty with you today, that the next person after you might pull the rug out from under me. So why should I really let you come to bear on me and really come to the table with a deal?
You've made a very important point, and I do think that restoring confidence in America's operations is not going to be easy. And I think the effects, the truth is, foreign policy doesn't come in 4-year segments. And as I do teach, I keep talking to my students about the fact that the previous administration always leaves something on the table. And there's no question that what has happened in terms of America's good word has been undermined, and therefore an approach in which we try to really spend time listening to other countries, and also explaining that we do want to have agreements, and we need to work within an international system. But I don't think that we can think it's all going to be just very easy, because the way that the Trump administration has operated has undermined confidence in the United States, and in many ways has made people doubt who we are as a country, what is our example. And so I do think it's going to be a lot of work, and diplomacy is the major tool. And I think that the State Department will be restaffed. Actually, you need diplomats to have a State Department, and the State Department needs to be refurbished also and brought back by somebody that understands how it works, as Tony Blinken and President Biden and Vice President Harris understand.
Mark, closing thoughts from you.
Well, we're talking about reasons for optimism. My closing thought is, it is clear that 2021 is going to be better than 2020 on many levels. But it does take real resources. I think the rhetorical commitments are very good, but it gets very easy to be distracted. There are so many issues facing an incoming Biden administration, facing governments around the world. And so certainly from my perspective, I hope that global health security insurance policy, if you like, is something we can put in place right now while the memories are still fresh and before it's in the rearview mirror. And it's going to be a hard road to get there, but I think we can do it.
Ian?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about reasons for hope. I mean, I know we've discussed many of the challenges in the past hour, but if you think about what we've been able to accomplish in terms of the world's doctors and scientists coming together over the last 9-10 months, well beyond the dreams of epidemiologists you'd speak to even a couple of months ago. And then you look at how much money there is in the system. The fact that the most innovative companies and entrepreneurs are the ones that are actually minting it right now. And indeed, 4 million startups in the United States in the last 10 months, mostly around new technologies. And we're seeing that in other countries in the world too. This is not a crisis that is hitting everyone. This is a crisis that actually has been incredibly good to the most innovative, the most forward-looking. You need to see that as an opportunity and also a responsibility, that in 2021, you have to take all of that capacity and it has to be oriented to fixing the problems for the people that otherwise won't just be left behind, but they're going to be really angry and they will make it unsustainable for that level of inequality. That's the promise of 2021. That's, I think, why we should be hopeful.
Necessity is the mother, as we talk about the role of women in the economy, definitely the mother of invention. Mark, Ian, and Madam Secretary, thank you all for your thoughts and time today. And thank you for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more about the Gates Foundation, you can sign up for their newsletter, The Optimist. Just head to gatesfoundation.org/The Optimist to subscribe. I'm Bertha Coombs. Thanks again for watching. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay hopeful in the year ahead.